Dylan heard Jimmy's Watchtower, overwhelmed, cried, changed his song forever. I wish he was here. September 1968. Bob Dylan was living quietly in Woodstock, New York, far from the chaos of the music industry. He'd retreated there after a motorcycle accident in 1966, seeking peace and time with his young family. The wild tours, the screaming fans, the pressure to be the voice of a generation, all of it felt distant now. He was writing differently, more introspectively, creating music that felt personal rather than revolutionary. In late 1967, he'd recorded an album called John Wesley Harding. It was sparse, acoustic, almost biblical in its imagery. One of the songs on that album was something he'd written during a thunderstorm, a cryptic 3-verse piece with 12 lines about a joker and a thief. He called it All Along the Watchtower. Dylan knew it was a good song. The imagery was strong, the mystery compelling, but it was also small, quiet, almost a sketch of an idea rather than a fully realized composition. When the album came out in December 1967, the song didn't make much of an impression. Critics mentioned it briefly. A few people liked it, but mostly it was just another Dylan track on another Dylan album. What Dylan didn't know in those quiet Woodstock days was that across the Atlantic, someone was listening to his small, quiet song with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Jimi Hendrix had gotten hold of the John Wesley Harding album before it was even officially released. Dylan's manager, Albert Grossman, had given advance copies to a few select artists, hoping they might cover some of the songs. When the album reached Jimmy's hands in London, he played it repeatedly, wearing out the grooves. There was something about All Along the Watchtower that spoke to Jimmy in a way Dylan's other songs hadn't. Later, he would try to explain it to interviewers. The songs Dylan usually gave me are so close to me that I feel like I wrote them myself. With Along the Watchtower, I had that feeling. In January 1968, just 1 month after Dylan's version had been released, Jimmy walked into Olympic Studios in London with an idea. He was going to record his own version, not a simple cover, a complete reimagining. A transformation that would take Dylan's acoustic meditation and turn it into an electric prophecy. The recording sessions were intense and obsessive. Jimmy worked for weeks, recording multiple takes, never satisfied, always hearing something in his head that wasn't quite making it onto tape. He brought in Dave Mason from Traffic to play 12-string guitar. Brian Jones from the Rolling Stones showed up, drunk and enthusiastic, trying to contribute percussion, but too intoxicated to keep time. Engineer Eddie Kramer later recalled having to politely remove Brian after 2 unusable takes. But it was Jimmy's guitar work that was revolutionary. He used a Gibson Flying V, working out his solos meticulously in advance, but then allowing spontaneity to take over in the moment. He grabbed whatever was at hand for slide work, knives, beer bottles, his Zippo lighter, even his rings. The sound he was creating wasn't just music, it was architecture, building a sonic landscape that Dylan's spare original had only hinted at. Jimmy wasn't satisfied with the first recordings at Olympic Studios. He took the tapes to the record plant in New York and started over, adding more guitar layers, more texture, more of whatever it was he was trying to express. The song was taking shape into something far beyond what Dylan had created. Louder, more urgent, more desperate, transformed from a folk meditation into a rock apocalypse that seemed to contain all the anxiety and chaos of 1968.
In September 1968, 9 months after Dylan's original, Jimmy's version was released as a single from his album Electric Ladyland. It was immediately clear that something extraordinary had happened. The song hit number 5 in the UK charts, number 20 in the US. Radio stations played it constantly. People who'd never paid attention to Dylan's original were stunned by what Jimmy had done. But the person most stunned was Bob Dylan himself. The exact moment when Dylan first heard Jimi's version isn't precisely documented, but the emotional impact is. Multiple sources place it in late September or early October 1968, probably at his home in Woodstock. Someone, perhaps a friend, perhaps his manager Albert Grossman, perhaps just someone who knew Dylan needed to hear what Jimi had done, brought him the single or played it for him on a turntable in his living room. Imagine that moment. Dylan, the master songwriter, the poet laureate of rock and roll, the man who'd written hundreds of songs that defined a generation, sitting down to listen to someone else's interpretation of his work. He'd heard covers before, some good, some bad, most respectful but ultimately forgettable. Then, the needle dropped, and for the next 4 minutes and something seconds, Bob Dylan heard his song transformed into something he'd never imagined it could be. What happened next would change Bob Dylan's relationship with his own music forever. Years later, in 1995, Dylan would describe that moment to a journalist from the South Florida Sun-Sentinel. The interview happened decades after Jimi's death, decades after Dylan had been playing the song Jimi's Way, but the memory was still vivid. His words were careful but honest. It overwhelmed me, really.
Overwhelmed. Not impressed, not pleased, not flattered. Overwhelmed. The word suggests something beyond simple appreciation, something that hits with emotional force, that breaks through defenses, that changes understanding on a fundamental level. It's the word you use when something is too big to process easily, when you're forced to rethink everything you thought you knew. He had such talent, Dylan continued, speaking about Jimi. He could find things inside a song and vigorously develop them. He found things that other people wouldn't think of finding in there. He probably improved upon it by the spaces he was using. That last phrase, improved upon it, is extraordinary coming from Bob Dylan. Dylan, who was famously critical of covers of his songs. Dylan, who rarely gave other artists credit for understanding his work. Dylan was admitting that someone had taken his song and made it better. But the most telling part of Dylan's reaction came in what he did next. He didn't just appreciate Jimi's version, he adopted it completely. I took license with the song from his version, actually, and continued to do it to this day, Dylan said in that same 1995 interview. Think about what that means. Bob Dylan, the original songwriter, changed the way he played his own composition to match what Jimi Hendrix had done with it. It's almost unprecedented in music history. A creator acknowledging that an interpreter understood the song better than he did, and then learning from that interpretation. In 1974, Dylan returned to touring for the first time since his motorcycle accident 8 years earlier. His first tour was with the band, the group he'd worked with during those legendary basement tape sessions. Expectations were enormous. Tickets sold out in hours. People were desperate to see Dylan back on stage after his long retreat. From the very first show in Chicago on January 3, 1974, at Chicago Stadium, he played All Along the Watchtower, but not the way he'd originally recorded it. He played it the way Jimi had. The tempo was different, faster, more urgent. The emphasis was different, with electric guitars driving the song forward instead of acoustic strumming. The entire feel of the song had been transformed from contemplative folk to driving rock. Music historians and Dylan scholars would later call it Hendrixized. Dylan was playing a cover of his own song. Some critics found it strange, others found it beautiful. But Dylan didn't care about the analysis. For him, it wasn't about copying or even about musical arrangement. It was about tribute. It was about honoring what Jimi had shown him the song could be, what it had always wanted to be, but hadn't been until Jimi found it. In the liner notes to his 1985 album Biograph, Dylan wrote something that revealed even more. I liked Jimi Hendrix's record of this, and ever since he died, I've been doing it that way. Strange how, when I sing it, I always feel it's a tribute to him in some kind of way. Ever since he died. Those words carry weight. Jimi Hendrix died on September 18, 1970, in London. He was 27 years old, and from that day forward, every time Bob Dylan played All Along the Watchtower, which would become the most performed song in his entire catalog, he was thinking of Jimi. The tragedy at the heart of this story is simple and profound. Dylan never got to tell Jimi what his version meant to him, never got to thank him properly, never got to sit down over coffee or in a studio and talk about what Jimi had heard in that song that Dylan himself hadn't fully realized. Never got to ask how Jimi had known to add those specific guitar textures, that specific urgency, that specific transformation of the melody.
They'd met only once, years before all of this, in 1966 at a bar called the Kettle of Fish in Greenwich Village on McDougal Street. Both were intoxicated. Jimi would later say, stoned out of our minds. They mostly laughed, just hung around laughing, Jimi remembered. It was brief and meaningless, just two musicians crossing paths before either knew how intertwined their legacies would become, before either understood what they would mean to each other's art. At that moment in 1966, Dylan was already a superstar, the voice of a generation, the man who'd gone electric at Newport and changed the rules of folk music forever. Jimi was just a guitar player in a band, struggling to make it, unknown, unrecognized. Dylan probably didn't even remember the encounter afterward. Jimi remembered it vividly, but vaguely, the way you remember meaningful moments through a haze. After that night, their paths never crossed again. Jimi went to London in September 1966 and became a superstar himself within months. Dylan had his motorcycle accident and retreated to Woodstock to raise his family and rethink his life. They existed in different worlds, despite creating music that would be forever linked, despite Jimi covering multiple Dylan songs, despite Dylan coming to understand that Jimi might have understood his music better than anyone else alive. In 1968 and 1969, Jimi actually lived in Woodstock, staying in an apartment just a quarter-mile from Dylan's house. They were neighbors. Jimi drove around town in a red Corvette, hoping to understand how Dylan had transformed himself, trying to find whatever spiritual peace Dylan had discovered in those mountains. But they never met, never spoke, never had the conversation that could have happened. When Jimi died in September 1970, that conversation became impossible. And Bob Dylan was left with a debt he could never repay, gratitude he could never fully express to the person who deserved to hear it.
In 2015, when Dylan was honored as MusiCare's Person of the Year at a star-studded ceremony in Los Angeles, he used his acceptance speech to talk about artists who had covered his songs throughout his long career. He mentioned several names, several versions, talking about how different artists had approached his work. But when he got to Jimi Hendrix, something shifted. His voice changed. The usually detached, ironic Bob Dylan became something else for a moment. People who were there that night said they could hear the emotion breaking through Dylan's usually impenetrable delivery, could see something in his face that looked like genuine sadness mixed with gratitude. "We can't forget Jimi Hendrix," Dylan said, with what witnesses described as a beaming but sad smile. The kind of expression that contains contradictions, joy at the memory, pain at the absence. "He took some small songs of mine that nobody paid any attention to and brought them up into the outer limits of the stratosphere, turned them all into classics." Small songs, nobody paid any attention to. That's how Dylan described All Along the Watchtower before Jimi touched it. And then Jimi took it to the outer limits of the stratosphere. A phrase that captures not just commercial success, but artistic transcendence, the transformation of something earthbound into something that floats in space, free from gravity, eternal. Then came the line that still resonates with anyone who's ever lost someone they needed to thank. I have to thank Jimi. I wish he was here. I wish he was here. 4 words that contain decades of regret, gratitude, and loss. 4 words that Bob Dylan, master of language, poet of a generation, chose carefully because they expressed exactly what he felt. Not, I wish I could have thanked him, or I wish we could have talked, but simply, I wish he was here. Present tense, as if the absence is still fresh, still painful, still a wound that hasn't healed in 45 years.
By 2015, Dylan had been playing All Along the Watchtower as a tribute to Jimi for 41 years. He would continue playing it until the present day. To date, he's performed the song more than 2,250 times in concert, more than any other song in his vast catalog of hundreds of compositions. More than Blowin' in the Wind, more than Like a Rolling Stone, more than any of the songs that made him famous. And every single time, according to his own words, he feels Jimi's presence. The story of All Along the Watchtower isn't just about one artist covering another. It's about recognition. The moment when a creator realizes that someone else understood their work more deeply than they understood it themselves. It's about humility, the willingness to learn from interpretation, to admit that your sketch became a masterpiece in someone else's hands. But most of all, it's about absence. It's about the conversation that never happened, the thanks that was never delivered, the acknowledgement that came too late. Bob Dylan heard Jimi's version and was overwhelmed. He changed his song forever to honor what Jimi had created. And for more than 50 years, every time he plays it, he wishes Jimi was there to hear it, to know what it meant, to understand that his version didn't just improve the song, it transformed how Dylan understood his own art. If this story of missed connections and eternal tribute moved you, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who understands that sometimes the greatest honor we can give is to learn from those who see our work more clearly than we do. Have you ever had someone show you something about your own creation that you'd never seen? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like this video for more stories of music, gratitude, and the words we wish we'd said.